Welcome to AFSPA Talks, a production of the American Foreign Service Protective Association. Each week, we deliver informative health and wellness topics you want to know about, so be sure to subscribe to us on your favorite podcast channel. And if you have any questions about content discussed in this episode, ask them at AFSPA Live, our live Q&A session, streaming every last Thursday of the month at 11 a.m. Eastern Time on youtube.com/AFSPAcares. Now here's your host, Chief Operating Officer Kyle Longton.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of AFSPA Talks. I'm Kyle Longton, and along with me, back with us after a couple episodes, is Maddie Norton. Maddie, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Well, hey, you're the one who makes the magic happen in the background and making sure that people hear this. So it's not just me talking to myself. Speaking of not just talking to ourselves, we've got a lot of events coming up for members over the next month. This episode should be reaching members on, correct me if I'm wrong, October 30th.
That's correct. That is correct.
And so I just want to flag for our members, particularly those who are 65 and older, that on October 31st, so the day after this podcast comes out at 12 noon Eastern Time, we will have a live webinar that's focused on our new Medicare Part D, as in drugs, our prescription drug plan, the Medicare Part D prescription drug plan that we are launching in January of this year with auto enrollment for our stateside members age 65 and older. So please be on the lookout for that. Matt, we also have a lot of other things coming up. Season, I think.
Yes.
The events calendar have all that information on there now?
It does. And our open season page is live, aspa.org/open season, I believe is what it is. And you can find our updated brochures, all the events that is going on. Kyle is doing lots of webinars for our members and at all different times as well, so that if you're in Japan, you can catch one during the day or wherever you are.
Yeah, that's our goal, is to provide some options for people all around the world. We are having teams out traveling, and to look for that information from local sources. I'll tell you, I'm in the UK this week. We've got teams going to Germany, Paris, Brussels, Italy, Japan, and Korea. I don't want to share all of those dates just in case things change for specific locations, but check locally with your HR or union representative to find out when we might be in your area. And again, look for that information on the website Maddie shared. And I also want to encourage people to look at your options early and make changes early when open season starts November 13th, goes through December 11th. But there is, we are looking at the possible disruption with a possible government shutdown on November 17th, and that may not affect a lot of our members who may be considered essential and have to continue working, but it may affect some of those people in your HR offices or the payroll offices. And so you're looking at making a change, get the paperwork started early. Hopefully this warning makes no sense 3 weeks from now.
Yeah.
But I want to put it out just in case and to encourage people to think about it. So, man, we have a busy schedule. We've done a number of podcasts this month. We've got a busy schedule, sort of focused on open season for like the next 6 weeks. But I don't want us to ignore our health by just talking about benefits and changes and things like that. When we talk about our health, that includes mental health. We had World Mental Health Day on October 10th. Every year, that's the date. So we're a little bit behind in getting this episode focused on the mental health topic, behavioral health topic out to people. We also don't want to ignore, again, health or the trends that we're seeing in this space. So we've been seeing increases in diagnoses and prescriptions for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. And we've got a guest with us today, but before we get to that, Maddie, you've mentioned in a previous AFSPA Live about your own diagnosis and experience with this, and I wonder if you'd expressed that you're willing to share a little bit about that now at the top of the episode. So I just want to open it up to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. So I am lucky enough, I was born in a family with 2 teachers as my parents. So, when I turned 6 and I started going to kindergarten, my mom kind of started noticing like these might be symptoms of ADHD or these might be behaviors. And so I was diagnosed with ADHD at the age of 6. And My mom is great, and she kind of enrolled me in some therapy just to see if there's any behaviors that we could correct or, start to adjust. And then I was also started on medication. And I do believe that if I hadn't gotten started on that, I think that my life would have been very different. ADHD presents differently in everyone who has it or things like that. So like my ADHD really presents in the ways of like being a lack of motivation. I love to talk. So a lot of times I was called out for talking in class when I wasn't supposed to. But then it also doesn't present in the most normal ways that people may think. Like I'm very organized. I have a great handle on time management most times. But then there are also days where the time flies by me, or I'll get sucked into a video game, or these days it's TikTok. And,
Very easy. Yes.
yeah, very easy, very easy. And a lot of times, especially in girls, it is hard to diagnose ADHD because it doesn't seem typical. So I might not present as, bouncing off the walls or fidgeting or things like that, but it presents in other ways. And I think that because I was able to get help so soon, that I was able to learn skills that helped with, my organization, my time management. I am able to do so many other things that when I don't take my medicine or I don't like have therapy or anything, I definitely notice. And I definitely think that Brightline is such a great resource in that case. I am still learning at the age of 26 so many things about ADHD, and just so many research has come out and so much information is out there to learn and especially empathize with others. I was lucky enough to have a great family who understood and made sure to understand like why I was acting this way or why I was doing this. But at the same time, like my sister was diagnosed with ADHD at age 19. And then my mom was also diagnosed, I believe when she turned like 50. So like it is something that doesn't, there is no like correct time span or age to be diagnosed. Like it is something that does happen throughout your life. And there's all kinds of treatments. And thankfully we live in a day and age where there's education out there. And it is always good to just, empathize with people and understand that ADHD it does have to do with your mental health, but that doesn't mean that it's something negative. And I definitely have learned to embrace my ADHD as I've grown up, and now it's like a little fun fact about me, I feel like.
Well, I thank you very much. Thank you for sharing that. I am delighted to hear like there's more than a few years that separate us in terms of age, and we were just talking about this separately, but like when I was of an age where one might be diagnosed, sort of elementary school, where I saw friends diagnosed, like the solution was just write a prescription, put them
Yep.
on a drug, and no other intervention. So I'm glad to hear. We'll hear from our guests today about sort of the ways in which it's evolved, but to even just hear the services you were able to access at such a young age, and how it came together with other treatments to really provide to make you who you are today.
Yes,
And
exactly.
we're delighted to have that person as part of the AFSPA team and
Thank
on the
you. Thank you.
podcast. So, Manny, I appreciate you sharing that with us. I hope you'll stick around for the interview, and please jump in because I have a lot to offer in this conversation. I'm learning a lot in our interview today, and from you. So please jump in because I'm sure I will miss some things. But I do want to introduce our guests for today. AJ Harris is a behavioral health coach at Brightline. In past roles, AJ has focused on family intervention and treatment models and has directly provided care to caregivers and children alike. AJ has a master's in psychology with a focus on child development and cognitive neuroscience. AJ has spent a lot of his career researching, creating content, and providing intervention for children with ADHD, and we're glad to have him with us today. AJ, welcome to AFSPA Talks.
Hello, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
We're so glad to have you here and to be with us sort of at the end of October, which is Mental Health Awareness Month, and included mental health. Let me start again. I apologize.
No worries.
And it's not May. It's not May. It's
I know.
October. Okay. All right. Here we go. All right. AJ, welcome to AFSPA Talks.
Hello, thank you for having me.
We're so delighted that you could be with us, and earlier this month was World Mental Health Day, so we're catching up a little bit, but we're also using this opportunity to talk a little bit of a topic that we've heard a lot from members, and we are also seeing a lot in some of the reports we get for our health plan, for the Foreign Service Benefit Plan, which is ADHD. And so for me, and also for maybe many of our listeners, I'd like to start off with some of the basics, starting with just what is ADHD?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it's a very important question. ADHD is one of the most common neurodevelopmental disorders, I would say. I think there's a lot of, we could say, conventional wisdom around ADHD, the evolution of it throughout the years. And, there's some misunderstanding around. So I'm happy to share a little overview of what it is and, my take on it, my experience with it as well. I would say one of the most important components to understanding ADHD is understanding the extent in which it impairs or affects an individual, right? So we're looking at things like social components, emotional components, cognitive functioning, really, the overall impact that it has on outcomes of situations and circumstances. Also, the various settings that it can impact, I think, is where, we see just a lot of substantial evidence around school, at home, sports practices, just all these different settings, right? One of the most important distinctions, I think this is what I make a lot with my members, those that I'm working with ADHD, is the key differences between what is a symptom and what is a behavior, right? I like to think of behaviors as what is objective, what can we see, what is occurring, and symptoms, obviously, this is more of the clinical side or the diagnostic side of it. So various symptoms, I think, associated with ADHD, you think of things like hyperactivity, hyperfocusing, impulsivity, struggles with task management, task orientation, organizational skills, and then the all-encompassing executive functioning, right? Behaviors more so are like not listening in school, right? Or engaging with somebody instead of doing what we're supposed to be doing, or hyper-focusing on things, forgetting, fidgeting, excess body movement. All of these are more of the behavior side. So when I'm working with members, I like to really differentiate between the two, because we can get very stuck in one camp or the other, right? Between a symptom or what is a behavior. And we'll talk a little bit more about the approach that we take within coaching as we focus on behavior versus like that clinical approach where we're looking more at how to treat these symptoms and understanding different treatment models. Really, I think another important component to understanding ADHD is looking at the role and the involvement of dopamine, which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar. But dopamine is a neurotransmitter very commonly associated with like the feel-good neurotransmitter of the brain, right? It helps to move and facilitate a lot of, we look at motor movement. We also look at reward, right? Reward and motivation. A lot of recent evidence and research that is looking at this role of dopamine, just on the role of these attentional concerns. I think dopamine is, again, referred to as that feel-good chemical, but it's the way that we're rewarded for things that we do, right? And the levels of dopamine can directly relate to that level of motivation, reward, engagement, how we're engaging in a task. Obviously, I work with children, so the common example that I always think about from parents or caregivers, video games, they can sit all day and play video games, right? No distraction. They're very zoned into it, versus like when we have to do homework and separate, it can be really difficult. That's dopamine, right? It's the motivations, the engagement that we're feeling. So I think, developmentally, we see a lot of those concerns just throughout various developmental stages and age ranges, but it's pretty common when we think of motivation. I would probably rather play video games than do homework often, but it's also how we separate and how dopamine can really affect that and input that. So brief overview of it. ADHD is one of those things we could talk about, a high level overview, a low level overview all day long, because there's so much,
Okay.
There's so many components to it, but hope that helps to kind of simplify a bit.
It does, absolutely. And I guess that leads to my next question, which is sort of how common, what is the prevalence of ADHD?
Yeah. Very prevalent, and also I would say very common. The last statistic I saw was from the CDC. I believe it was over 9% of children in the United States being diagnosed and treated for ADHD. And that's an important thing to think about too, is the diagnosis component and the treatment component. How many are undiagnosed or even misdiagnosed is an important consideration to make. Also noting that there's some surveys as a part of the research and evidence around the statistics that boys are much more likely to be diagnosed and treated than girls. And I think the figure is somewhere around 16% of boys in the United States who or children that are diagnosed are boys in the U.S. So I think that's an important factor, an important thing to consider. But we look at also the criteria for a diagnosis. I think that varies no matter where we are, regionally, state to state. The diagnostic criteria definitely is different and varies, which I think this is a bit of a struggle with ADHD, that there aren't as clear of guidelines or diagnostic criteria. Obviously we have certain components of a diagnosis that we look at, but I think it's an important consideration to make for the future is how can we narrow this and find better criteria to be able to look at. And I think, again, something to reiterate, just thinking about the commonality of ADHD, like I said before, we all struggle with some associated behaviors with attention, right? I think naturally as humans, again, we follow dopamine. We fixate on things that make us feel good and that motivate us and drive us. So thinking about the prevalence of ADHD, especially when we think of development, children who are younger, 6, 7, 8, when we start to see these concerns of like, are they paying attention? Are they invested? We have to factor in the natural occurrence of dopamine and the way that we are motivated by tasks. So I think the diagnosis itself is rather common. Attentional concern itself, very, very significant, very common in humans.
Okay. Well, and I think you just touched on sort of what my next question was, which is when do people, and I may use the wrong word here, when do people start demonstrating behaviors that I was going to say symptoms, but I think behaviors may be the better term here, that are associated with ADHD, and a diagnosis of that or may lead to looking at that?
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's an important question. It's a difficult question, right? Because I think kind of just like what I overviewed, I think children start showing signs, symptoms, behaviors pretty early. I think we'll recognize it maybe even around age 3, 4. Again, when we look at that developmental timeline, certain stages of development, it's going to be natural to see attentional concerns in children in early development, even in later development, right? Again, the role of dopamine. I think that's why I wanted to introduce that concept a bit early, because dopamine it's a huge factor. So it's natural, it's very common for a developing brain to struggle with some of these. So that's where it gets difficult with like the diagnosis or understanding how do we start or when do we start intervening and receiving treatment? Because if this is a common thing that is occurring, at what point do we wait, right? So I would say like the most common, the biggest concern that we can see with symptoms would be like ongoing persistent struggles, right? And managing certain things. And also, like I said before, across settings. If we see attentional concerns at school, at home, on the playground, if we see them all over the place, we're going to be more concerned, and we're going to start to, weigh our options when it comes to intervention or treatment. So, I think that's an important consideration. If we only see attentional concerns at school, I think it's important to understand why. Look at the motivation for the child behind that. Is it a class, right? Is it math class? For myself, it was always math class, right? Like I could sit in science, history, thrive. Get into math class is very difficult for me to maintain focus and attention. It's a numbers thing. So I think a lot of children have that experience as well. So it's good to factor and understand all things. The 3 core symptoms or the 3 core behaviors as well: inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity, right? We're looking at, again, across the board, the multi-systemic effect that this has really on ADHD. I think ADHD naturally will extend into adulthood as well. If we don't receive early intervention or early treatment for it. There's a really cool thing, and I'm sure we'll talk more and more about this, but when it comes to intervention and treatment, we think about rewiring the brain. A lot of neuroscience tells us neuroplasticity, meaning the brain is adaptable, the brain can change. Specifically, and more importantly, when we're much younger, when we're early in development, our brains are way more susceptible to changing. So it's good to have that intervention at that time, because it's going to be a lot easier. I love the phrase, "You can't teach an old dog new tricks." It's kind of true for humans as well. Not necessarily true, but in the same sense. So if it develops into adulthood, if it's not caught when we're children, if we're not treated as a child, it's going to be, we can definitely find systems and we can receive treatment into adulthood, it's going to be a little bit more difficult than it would have been if we received that treatment when we're much younger. But yeah, I think it's becoming more and more common too, as again, the diagnostic criteria changes, but a lot of adults being diagnosed with ADHD as well.
Yeah.
There's a physician, one of my favorite humans on this planet, Dr. Gabor Mate. He's a really wonderful physician. He works in a lot of areas of child development, trauma, ADHD, but he was actually diagnosed with ADHD as an adult. He has a book on it called Scattered Minds. It's really, really a wonderful read. But he talks about, his success in life. And then he gets to be, I think he was in his 50s or 60s. And he's like, wait, I have ADHD. And, he gets this diagnosis. He's like, what would my life have been? What would the shifts and changes have been? And so he also has a podcast, and he's featured on a lot of podcasts. So I would encourage anyone to look into his work. Really wonderful human. But it really puts it into perspective, right? Of, he's this highly esteemed and achieved physician who has done all these wonderful things. And then he had this kind of coming to terms of like, wait, I had ADHD this whole time. So I think it speaks a lot about, what ADHD is and how we can manage, but how can we thrive in the same sense as well? How can we kind of change and receive that early intervention to, maybe thrive more? So it's kind of undetermined, but yeah.
And I think that's so important to talk about the growing number of adult diagnoses, because I think there was also child of the 80s and 90s here. There was a perception, I remember when I was growing up, that like, oh, they'll grow out of it. And so we'll just wait it out. And that turns out not to be the case. And so we're finding people who didn't have the early intervention. So we're seeing more diagnoses in adulthood when from what I'm hearing from you, it's a bit more difficult to manage and to have as successful intervention. It can take a bit more time. So I think that's so important for people to know that, like, it's also, I'm glad we're talking about this, because I think, at least when I was growing up, there was some stigma around this diagnosis, or sometimes there were jokes around it. Oh, that person must have, at that time we were saying ADD, weren't properly using the H yet, but like, to remove that, like, this is a diagnosis. It may vary a bit from state to state, and then treatment's going to look different for various people. And you touched on some of this, but I'm wondering if you can, we're specifically talking about children today. That's your area of expertise. What does treatment look like for children? And it may be different for everybody. What are some of the commonalities?
Yeah, definitely. And it just kind of follows right into this conversation too when it comes to treatment. So I'll touch on this, but I think there's a really important understanding, and I've heard this explained through various physicians, neuroscientists, and experts in the field as well. So I like to kind of iterate that from them. There's various types of treatment that we can look at, and largely it depends on the diagnosis, depends on the severity, the impact, right? So as far as intervention strategies, treatment, I would say, again, we look at the disruption, right? The personal preference. There's so many factors again. Psychoeducation, standard. I'm a coach, right? So psychoeducation is my like fundamental, it's my truth. That's what I truly believe in, is that we can all increase our self-awareness by understanding more about how we operate and how we work as individuals. Emotional intelligence, social emotional skills, all of these things are so important in understanding mental processes and how we view ourselves too. Self-esteem being a very big component of this. I work with a lot of children within coaching, and parents will come to me, hey, we have this diagnosis of ADHD. We're receiving medication, but that's the extent of it. So I immediately am like, well, let's start with self-esteem. Let's understand how we view ourselves, how we respect ourselves. If we lose attention in class, how do we gently return that attention without self-judgment to be able to more effectively learn how to maintain and focus on attention? So that's my beginning stages, right? And then looking at, again, I think varying with the symptoms and looking more so at, where is the particular area of impact? Skills training being very important, another dynamic of coaching. So skills training, organizational skills, time management, attentional training. There's so many cool things around concentration grids and inattentional blindness. And, there's so much research and so many cool things to check out and try in that regard. Mindfulness, again, my coaching hat coming out, but mindfulness, being present-minded, using all of our senses to be aware of where we are, rooted in where we are, and make more informed decisions about that. But yeah, all the skills, I think, being very important. And then of course medication intervention, right? I think this is what Again, falling back to that conventional approach, I think medication intervention is it's a hot topic, right? When it comes to children, stimulants for children. I think the medications are very, very effective, and this is something I'm very motivated to get out there and talk about, because I think the stigma around that can be, you're in a camp or another, right? It's hard to determine, and it's hard to conceptualize giving a child a stimulant. There's very extensive levels of research and extensive levels of evidence indicating the efficacy of stimulants. I think a way I like to explain it, and this is also what I think is very important about the levels of intervention, is, I'll have families come in, they'll have an ADHD diagnosis for their child, receive medication intervention, and there's no pamphlet that comes along with an ADHD diagnosis, right? There's no true understanding. A lot of physicians and doctors, family doctors, they may not fully understand the diagnosis, right? I think we generally get a good sense of it, but knowing, the impact, it's very important to know. And I think that's what I always try to provide within coaching, is a lot of extensive education. It helps. It's really helpful, again, with that self-awareness piece. Medication is very effective in the way that it shows our brain how we should be working, right? How we should be functioning in a very effective way. I always get parents say, like, why give him a stimulant when he's very active already, right? I'm like, this is an important question. It's very hard to conceptualize. But then when we break it down and we think about it, how the brain factors into this, largely, again, dopamine playing a very important role in ADHD, but we think about like our prefrontal cortex, right? This is where a lot of regulation happens. I like to think of it as like the funnel of the brain, right? A lot of information comes through that area, and we have to kind of designate, put it in other places. So if you imagine you have a very small funnel and you try to put a bunch of information down it, it's going to overflow and it's going to spill into these other areas. Another thought around it is areas in the prefrontal cortex that deal with that modulation, which would, being able to modulate neurotransmitters, information within the brain. It can be dormant, right? And that's why we use something to stimulate, to activate it. If we have a dormant area of the brain, it's less active than it should be. Let's give it a stimulant. Let's activate it and let it do the work that it needs to do. So sort of like this filtering system that we have to wake up sometimes. So that's an important, stimulant is to activate. There's Dr. Andrew Huberman. He has a podcast, Huberman Lab, and he talks a lot about a lot of children with ADHD are going to crave things like sugars and things that make them feel more active because they're naturally fulfilling that need within their brain, right? Even some adults, I've talked to a lot of adults with ADHD, and it's like, man, caffeine makes me tired. I could drink it before bed. I'm like, that is so funny because, it's your brain naturally fulfilling. It's like, I feel regulated when I drink coffee and when I, fulfill that need. So I think that's an important consideration, just the way that it's filtered. So again, I hope that can provide some insight to those maybe even struggling with that idea of a stimulant for a child, because when it comes to it, we're simply awakening, this area of the brain to make it more functional rather than like overstimulating an area, which is the common belief sometimes. Again, I'll fall back to education, right? Becoming more aware. I think no matter the treatment or the style of intervention that, somebody may choose, education is going to be one of the most effective ways to increase self-awareness. It's truly fundamental across all treatment methods to be able to have that education as a, main component to it.
And that's incredible information, because I think that the particular questions around why would you take stimulant is a question that comes up for a lot of people who are either directly affected or indirectly affected, or just on the outside going, how's this work? And I appreciate having that information. And I also appreciate, one of the big things we try to do here at AFSPA with a number of our programs is make sure that there's some sort of human connection, whether it's through a coaching program or something like that. And I think you've highlighted several times, but I'm going to ask you to bring it together about like, what can Brightline do to help our members? And I'll just also make a quick note that this is available to our members in the United States only at this time. But there's a lot that I mean, we've heard it from you, but there's a lot that I know that you and your colleagues at Brightline Health can do to help not only a child who's been diagnosed with ADHD, but also their parents, maybe even siblings and others in their life who may be indirectly affected by this. So I wonder if you can walk us through a little bit about the support that Brightline can offer.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I appreciate like the opportunity to kind of summarize that into how Brightline can handle and manage. I specifically am a coach at Brightline. We do offer both coaching and therapy. So talking more in like a coaching sense, but obviously, you know, I think naturally therapy is going to be a very, very effective strategy. And I'll touch on that a bit. But within coaching, we offer kind of like I discussed before, two core components. I would say being psychoeducation, again, learning and instilling self-awareness, and then skill building. So addressing day-to-day type of behaviors and concerns, right? If every day I go into this class and I have the same struggle, why don't we do something different, right? Why don't we try and adjust small things, troubleshoot that, set goals around it? That's really the coaching approach, right? How can we facilitate healthy growth and ensure that progress is being made? Therapy is going to take a very similar approach, right? I think therapy is going to be a more in-depth approach to what the diagnosis is, right? So diving deeper into the nature of concerns. Therapy is always going to be an intervention-based model as well. So at Brightline, we use cognitive behavioral therapy models. And this looks like treating clinical concerns, right? So we're providing treatment. We also do medication management through our therapy programs as well. So we're able to provide that ongoing medication management, make adjustments, hold meetings with our psychiatrists to be able to adjust and also provide that education. I think that's something, I might be biased, but I think Brightline does that very well, where we work to provide so much education that has been missing in past models. But within coaching, you know, for those that aren't quite familiar with coaching, you know, we work one-on-one with children, we work one-on-one with caregivers on the education and skill building components. This looks like implementing new systems at home, new strategies within affected settings, and, you know, learning how to best support yourself and also how to best support your family. You know, from a caregiver perspective, like you shared, you know, we can have a child that is diagnosed with ADHD and then siblings who can be affected, you know, by the various settings and the various struggle getting out the door for school, or, you know, helping with chores and different task management. So I think education is equally as important for the whole family, and you know, empathy being a very important component to that too. How can we learn to be able to be more empathetic for those that might be struggling too? You know, I think the ongoing support for caregivers I find to be really important. Like I said before, there's no pamphlet that we get when, you know, we get this diagnosis. So I think being able to almost write our own pamphlet and specify this for our child in particular, I think is really, really important. Brightline itself, you know, we offer all pediatric related mental health concerns too. So, you know, I think separate from ADHD, we offer and provide support for all of the various, you know, other concerns and even associations. I think a very, very important thing to highlight as well, and something that I kind of mentioned earlier, you don't need an ADHD diagnosis to be able to receive support for attentional concerns too. This is another, I would say, missing component to just mental health treatment, and specifically that I know of the United States, right? We're very stigmatized that we need this diagnosis. And I even think about school settings, right? IEPs and 504 plans receiving additional support. Often you need a diagnosis to be able to get that extended support. And some children aren't going to meet the criteria for a diagnosis because of that, you know, delay. There's not necessarily this effect at school, but there could be this effect specifically in math, you know? So we want to explore that and really better understand the influence and the impact there. So, but yeah, I think as Brightline stands, you know, we have this tier system. We have Connect being like our virtual platform, right? So this is where caregivers can create an account, sign into their account. They have collections, resources, articles, research, all the things that we've collected to be able to support. This is all free of charge, along with the coach chat. So, you know, you can have a chat directly with, you know, a coach like myself, be able to explore, learn, get tips and tricks, things that we can try, and this is all free. To be able to pursue coaching, we sign up, right? We go through steps and stages, looking at, there's paperwork to complete, various surveys, questionnaires and such. And by the end of that, you're prompted to schedule with a coach or schedule with a therapist, whichever we feel like is better placed. So, you know, in order to receive that, we have to go through that sort of process or system. But again, the coach chat, there are collections, articles, resources, those are all free of charge to anybody to sign up.
Great. That's great. And I think it's just also worth noting, or emphasizing again, I should say, that while we're talking specifically about ADHD today, that is not the only, you know, only diagnosis, the only area in which Brightline can offer support. We've done webinars before in various areas intended for support for children and parents who are supporting their children in these needs. So I think, and at those three levels of care, the Connect, the coach, and the care levels, I think are available across that after these intakes. So, and as noted before, it is available nationwide in the U.S. Not accessible for our over numbers at this time. But AJ, before we wrap today, is there anything more that you'd like to add, or anything that we missed in our discussion?
No, I mean, I really appreciate you all for having me on today. I think just again highlighting the importance of mental health support, right? I think any child, any caregiver can reach out to get that support. No matter what the type of care that you're looking for, it's just so important for children to have space to be able to learn, advocate for themselves, and truthfully, even just spending time being mindful, sitting down. I was just having this conversation yesterday with an 8-year-old, which I think is hilarious. It's like, how before we started meeting, how often did you sit and think about your emotions and think about how your day was in a positive way? He's like, oh, never. I never do this. So I think naturally that's going to have some reward. It's going to have some effect to be able to have space to be mindful and be aware of yourself. And I think ADHD in particular, it's something that's just largely been misunderstood for a while. So similar to many mental health concerns, to be honest with you, right? I think just across the board, things have been misconstrued. And so I would encourage anyone to, continue to stay informed, reach out for support, no matter the severity or need. Someone's always going to be willing and available to support you and help you, no matter the concern.
And I have one last question I'd love to ask.
Yeah.
You were talking about the importance of mental health and the importance of, reaching out for help. And I would love to hear what you would say specifically to parents or caregivers, or even maybe children or teens who are thinking like, do I have ADHD, or like, does my child have ADHD? Or maybe like a teacher reached out and said, hey, so-and-so is showing signs of this. And, they might feel that stigma that Kyle was talking about earlier about like, a lot of people will say, well, like my kid isn't hyperactive, like he keeps to himself or he does this. What would you say to parents who are nervous about the stigma that could be created if they do get their child, like their child does have ADHD and they, treat them to therapy? Like, what would you say to those parents who are kind of hesitant when it comes to, getting the help their child may need due to the stigma around it?
Yeah, definitely. This is such an important topic, and it's so relevant. Something that I feel like I have conversations I have very often. My first thought to that is, let's look at the long term, right? Like just kind of like what I explained earlier. What is the long term benefit of getting support now? And that is, being able to thrive in any capacity, any stage of life. I think receiving that early intervention, even just receiving the education. I think very cool thing and something I love about virtual care is it's very discreet, right? If the stigma is there and it's something that, naturally you would like to avoid, I think virtual care is a really great option. Just the flexibility of it. I think that's our mission at Brightline is to really be able to work with families, meet families where they are. And, I think even just outside of Brightline, any sort of care that is going to work best for you, we want to think about the long term, right? The investment that it takes, because it is a process. And I think the earlier that you can get started, it's always going to be the most beneficial. And it doesn't always just look like treatment. It doesn't always look like intervention. It can look like education. It can look like research, finding articles online, being able to just further explore these things, and then talking to a professional. Again, through Brightline, we have our coach chat, which is free. And, all coaches are very well versed in all mental health concerns, but specifically with ADHD. So it's as simple as signing up and sending a chat. Hey, this is what's going on, right? How, what's your perspective on this? What's your take on this? And coaches even working with providing, evidence-based research and articles that can be able to, better inform. So it's such an important question. And I think, again, education important, but also investing in the future, investing in that long-term effect is that would be my approach or my take on that.
AJ, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise on this and your enthusiasm about your role as a coach in this area. And we'll provide some information just a couple minutes here at the end of the podcast about how members of Foreign Service Benefit Plan can take advantage of the services offered by you and your colleagues at Brightline. So thank you again.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks to Maddie for sharing her own experience with us and for her insight in the conversation today. And thanks again to AJ for joining us and for the team at Brightline Health for making this discussion happen. To learn more about Brightline and enroll today and begin accessing their Connect features, as well as going through an assessment to find out if coaching or care may be right for you, please visit www.hellobrightline.com/FSBP. We'll also put a link in the show notes. Brightline Health coaches and providers are considered in-network providers with the Foreign Service Benefit Plan in the U.S. Services are available only to those members located in the United States. No services are available overseas at this time. This has been AFSPA Talks, a production of the American Foreign Service Protective Association. All information offered in this podcast is meant to be educational. The views expressed by the hosts and guests are their own and do not necessarily represent AFSPA. Should there be any discrepancy between information offered in this podcast and official plan documents for the Foreign Service Benefit Plan or the other products offered by AFSPA, the policy provisions will prevail. Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe to AFSPA Talks to catch our next episode. Please rate and review us on your favorite podcast app and share feedback with us on Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn. Search for @AFSPACares. We'll be back in a couple weeks with some episodes focused on open season. We'll talk again then.
Thanks for joining us this week on AFSPA Talks. Be sure to subscribe to our channel so you'll never miss an episode. If you have any follow-up questions about the topics in this episode, join our AFSPA Live Q&A session on the last Thursday of every month. We will be streaming live on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/AFSPACares at 11 a.m. Eastern Time to answer your questions. Thanks for listening.